Well, I think we can start. First of all, on behalf of CEBRI, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining today's webinar. As a way of introduction, I would say that I think we all agree that we are living in an unstable and to a large extent unpredictable international order. Old and new topics are with us. Topics such as climate change, or such as coronavirus combat, and they require a very high level of international cooperation, and cooperation is still uncertain. We don't know whether it's going to be there. Countries are not going to recover evenly from the economic crisis that they have been experiencing since 2020. Growth disparities will increase, and the distance between poor and rich countries also is going to increase. A crucial question, what's the future of international debates? What's the future of multilateral discussions remains unanswered. And what's coming next in the short run and in the long run will depend first and foremost on China and the US, their own dialogue and their own connections with the rest of the world. Today, we will focus on China, how China regards the way ahead and approaches its role in the world reality. We are privileged to have three excellent speakers this morning, and they are not here by chance. We invited them because given their diverse fields of work and diverse background, they can throw each one of them an individual and special eye on the Chinese reality and give us different perspectives about the topic before us. Liu Haibin is a professor of international relations. He's a senior research fellow at deputy director at the Institute of Foreign Policy Studies at Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. He is a deep and solid academic. I must say on a personal basis that sometimes I have to write something about China or participate in a discussion, and I give him a call and ask for his views on certain topics and his reading suggestions, and I have always counted on his generosity. Daniel Bell, a Canadian citizen living in China for more than 20 years, has written and spoken extensively about the organization of the Chinese state, about meritocracy in China, and about East-West political differences. His acclaimed book, The China Model, and his more recent book, I think it was published in 2020, Just Hierarchy, are reference books to whoever wants to understand modern China. He is presently the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shanghai University and professor at Tsinghua University. Shang Huan, in turn, is a journalist. He is the deputy managing editor and editorial board member at Caixin, the Chinese equivalent of The Economist, a vehicle that everyone who follows China seriously has to read on a regular basis. Also, on a personal note, while I was ambassador in Beijing, I benefited a lot from his insights and the chats we had in Beijing. So we have an excellent trio here. In the next 1 hour and a half, I think we'll have a perfect mix of minds to discuss the topic before us, China and its future in the world. The procedures are going to be as follows. Each one of the speakers is going to speak for 15 minutes. Then I will interact with them. And then if there's time available, I hope there will be some, we will entertain a few questions. Perhaps not many because we have 1 hour and a half of session of webinar session here. And without much ado, Liu Haibin, you start.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Marcos Calamuro. It's my great honor to be here to meet virtually friends from Brazil, a South Atlantic country. I would like to say this, and a country from the South world, from the other part of the Western Hemisphere. It's quite international, international identity of the country. So I hope today, I would also like to talk about China's approach to the global politics from an international perspective. Firstly, I'd like to say that China's external strategy won't have a huge change in the near future. I have some reasons for this argument. The first is the past international cooperation of China was quite successful. China benefited a lot from its economic integration into the world economy. After joining the WTO, China shared a lot of the external economic opportunities of the rest of the world. And at the same time, China shared its own growth opportunities with the others. So today, I think China is not only the second largest economy, it is also quite an important development partner for the rest of the world. So I don't think this will change in the future. And second, China doesn't want to support the transition of the international order through war, because in the modern history of China, China was a victim of the all kinds of wars. So this kind of bit history, memory of China, tells China a lot about its future orientation to the international order. And third, I think China has a different vision about the world. Just as the other major powers in the world history, China has a very special culture and understanding of itself and as well as the world. So from the Chinese history, the Chinese culture traditions are quite diversified. So it has many minorities in its territory. So this kind of living style with different culture, different people, so they have helped China to form a quite inclusive governance and vision towards the country and also the world. Because if you look at China's neighbors, yes, there are a lot of countries were highly influenced by the Chinese culture, but also we have we have neighbors with different religions from India, from Arab world, the Central Asian countries. So China used to live with different cultures in the long history. So in China's vision about the future world and today's world, it sees quite a diversified and multipolar world. So China wants to adapt itself to this kind of world. And fourth, I think China has a quite globalized approach to think about today's world. In China, I think we think about the international politics from a quite a globalized dimension. Because different from the rise of other powers in history, today's the level of the interdependence and globalization was the highest for the rising powers. And the challenge also is unprecedented, like the climate change, the development issue, and also the global financial crisis. These global challenges calls for a global solution and the cooperation among the major powers. So it's understandable why China offers a vision to build a human community of shared future. So this is a very strategic and real thinking about the world. And also my last point about why China won't change a lot, it is because today's world order is a so-called international order after the Second World War. I think some people might misread this the nature of this order. It was not built on one or two superpowers. It was built on a spirit of cooperation among major powers. That's why the Cold War had brought a lot of setbacks for this order. So we need to remember the spirit of this order. And so in this big picture, I think China's future external strategy will focus on the continuum of the globalization and its opening up and reform. And at the same time, China don't emphasize that the current order and the future order won't be a Western order or American order. It should be an international order and a global order. So China will pay attention to the relationship with the United States and its allies, but also pay at least the same importance to its relationship with the rest of the world. So I think I'd like to also talk about today my understanding, my observation about today's leadership of the United States. I think there are some shortcomings of today's American understanding of itself and as well as the world. The first, I think it's understandable for the US to maintain and prolong its international leadership status. But at the same time, it cannot overlook that the post-Second World War order was based on some inclusiveness, cooperation, and diversity. So it's not today's world is not the post-Cold War order. Sometimes we call it the American moment. And second, I think the United States is still has some sense of superiority. This is outdated increasingly for today's world. And also, I think the third shortcoming for the United States, maybe it has some kind of idea of the American first or American exceptionalism. This is quite not suitable for the international community, because the American economy is still playing a quite important role for the world growth. But today, the major American economic initiatives are mainly focused on the domestic agenda, sometimes at the cost of others' economic interests. So which makes the American market less reliable and unpredictable for its important economic partners, not only China, but also its neighbors like Mexico, Canada. And for the American foreign policy, I think there are also some weaknesses. The first is the value or ideology-oriented policy, which offers the United States the privilege to label some kind of technology companies or international cooperative initiatives, some ideology flag, which makes the international market and the world economy fragmented. And and the second weakness of the American foreign policy is that the lack of the continuity. Like the Trump administration created a lot of international forums and institutions. Even the Biden administration said American is back. But we don't know the next administration's choice. So, which reduced the commitment of the United States to the international arrangements and commitment. So, which make the international cooperation much more difficult and vulnerable to this domestic change of the United States. And also, sometimes it's quite difficult for the rest of the world to understand a phenomenon of the United States. The country is the most powerful country, but also at the same time, the country is the one lack of the security sense. And so against this situation, I think China is still working hard to try to maintain and stabilize its relationship with the United States. Because China knows without the coordination and the cooperation among the major powers, the United Nations system and also other international arrangements cannot work well. So during this pandemic period, China make its own efforts to develop vaccine, to ensure supply of the vaccines to the overseas market, and trying to be a reliable and stable supplier and also consumer for the global economy, since China now, the domestic market is almost fully opened. And also China maintained its engagement with the United States in terms of the top leaders, the telephone talk, and talk in the senior officials talk in Alaska, and the specific talk on climate change in Shanghai. So we see China is still committed itself to the international agenda, especially in terms of the public health issue, the climate change issue. And also at the same time, you may observe that China enhanced its engagement with Europe because of the US shifting approach to its relationship with China. The rest of the world are facing the dilemma to choose sides between these two countries. I think this is true in Latin America, in East Asia, in Europe, maybe sometimes in Africa. But for the Europe, as a capable and quite international player, it has its own dilemma to choose to coordinate the relationship with China and the United States. For example, for Germany, Germany's relationship with Russia, they have some common interest to achieve energy security through strategic cooperation, but this was objected by the United States. And also, China and the EU has reached an economic agreement, which was also opposed by the United States. But most of the European countries attach importance to the Chinese market and also attach the importance to cooperation with China on the African development and also Middle East, maybe like Iran, Iran's energy cooperation with China and with the EU. Of course, China has some, the EU has some concerns about China. It wants to have more effective cooperation with China on climate change, on Iran nuclear issue, and also on how to avoid the financial and technological sanctions from the United States. And also how to, EU has to think about how to accept or understand better China's contribution to the Europe's economic and health concern, because China has invested a lot to the Eastern Europe countries. This sometimes was treated by the EU as a challenge to its leadership. So there are some more dialogue are needed for both China and the European countries. But strategically, I think it is in China and the EU's strategic interest to maintain a constructive and cooperative relationship with the United States. But I think the closer and the constructive cooperation between China and the EU might bring the United States into the right track of international cooperation. So that's why China has also attached the importance to the engagement with the rest of the world, especially the European countries. Of course, and as well as other key regional players like countries like Brazil, Iran, maybe India. So I think China will continue to support the new multilateral arrangements like the G20, the BRICS, this kind of things. And if Quad can work constructively for the global goods, I think China won't treat the Quad as a challenge. Depends on how the Quad defines itself in the future. So that's my idea. I look forward to some discussions about my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Very interesting to hear your views on the Chinese logic and Chinese positions on topics that we are reading every day about them in the papers and in different articles. Daniel, it's your turn.
Hello, so thank you so much for the kind invitation. And I should begin by saying I have a soft spot for both China and Brazil. I mean, China, I've been living and working here, as the ambassador mentioned, for over 20 years. Brazil, it's because of an experience when I was a teenage boy, but this is not the appropriate forum to elaborate. So let me just go straight into the question that I was asked to develop is China's vision of itself and of the world. And I should say that, of course, my own experience is quite limited. And I teach at Shandong University, which is the home of Confucian culture. And much of what I will say will be influenced by the Confucian tradition. So let me say a little bit about the ideals that inform domestic politics, and then I will say a bit about the ideals that inform international politics, and I'll try to get through this in 15 minutes. So please pardon me if I speak a little bit too fast. About domestic politics, I mean, I'm from Montreal, and if you read about China, they say, oh, it's authoritarian, it's totalitarian. But of course, those are not the ideals that we in China use to think of the political system here. So what are the ideals that we think of? Of course, there's always a gap between the ideals and the reality, right? Like in the US, it thinks of itself as a democracy, but everybody recognizes there's a huge gap between ideal and the reality. So it's a highly imperfect democracy, but still the ideal is democracy. So what are the ideals that inform Chinese domestic politics while recognizing there's a huge gap between the ideal and the reality? But once we're clear about the ideals, then we can use those ideals to assess progress and regress. Well, the first is, I think there's a basic commitment to human rights. We can call them thin human rights, rights against murder, torture, slavery, genocide. I mean, in principle, we all agree on protecting those rights. It wasn't always the case. Like in Imperial China, you could torture people publicly, tear apart their limbs, but now we agree we shouldn't do that. Of course, in practice, there might be deviations about human rights similar to the US, but in principle, we all agree. Also, the basic human right not to be poor, to basic material welfare. I think that's crucial to China's self-understanding. Also, there's a commitment to democracy that in some way or other, Chinese people can and should participate in politics. I mean, maybe it's different than North Korea, where there's expectation that no participation at all. But here, it need not take the form of one person, one vote. It could take different forms, but there's an expectation that there's some participation in politics. Besides that, what are the more kind of, let's say, difficult to understand from a foreign perspective? Well, again, I think one really key idea ideal informing Chinese politics is this ideal of political meritocracy, in Chinese 贤能政治, and it goes way back in Chinese history. And this is the ideal that the political system should aim to select and promote public officials with superior ability and virtue. Now, in Western countries, we have the idea of meritocracy for the civil service, right? You have to go through examinations in a meritocratic process, but to be a political leader, so long as people vote for you, that's fine. But in China, there's no clear distinction. Public official, there's no clear distinction between civil servant and political leader. You have to go through a meritocratic process, starting with examinations and then performance evaluations at lower levels of government. That lasts for decades before you can move up the top of the political hierarchy. That's the ideal, but it informs a practice to a very important extent, namely that you need a complex bureaucratic system to ensure that this meritocratic ideal works to a certain extent. And this idea, this practice of having, or this institution of a complex bureaucracy goes way back in Chinese history. Over 2,000 years ago, the very first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, developed a complex bureaucracy. And basically that has lasted for well over 2,000 years. So on the one hand, you have this ideal of political meritocracy. On the other hand, you have this institution of a complex bureaucratic system, which aims to select and promote public officials with superior ability and virtue. That's really key to understanding the Chinese political vision. Now, what about the idea that, well, we are officially a communist country? That's true. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that a very important task of public officials is to serve the people. Now, that's, of course, it's a communist ideal, but it's also a Confucian ideal. It goes way back in Chinese history that the main task, in Chinese political meritocracy, 贤能政治, this 贤 refers to virtue. And virtue here means the motivation and ability to serve the people, to serve the people's well-being. So that's a Confucian ideal, and it's also a communist or socialist ideal, still very central to China's self-understanding. Poverty reduction, very central to kind of socialism and to communism, also a Confucian ideal. From a Confucian standpoint, if you're striving for basic material necessities, it's very difficult to be virtuous or to care about other people. So the first task of government is to give people basic material necessities, to reduce poverty. It goes way back in Chinese tradition, and of course, it's been picked up by the Chinese Communist Party. And arguably, that's one reason why communism resonated in China and developed to a certain extent. Now, what about in the future? Once we reduce poverty, in fact, China has successfully, I mean, there's many things wrong in China. You know, we know the list, right? Corruption, environmental problems, big gap between rich and poor, and so on. But what has worked well is poverty reduction. And it's been estimated that 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Well, what happens once people are lifted out of poverty? Then what? Well, then it's a Confucian idea. You have to educate the people. Moral education becomes important. But what's real communist about it? Well, this is something that it might not be so important now, but it will be important 20, 30, 40 years from now, which is that at that point, the ideal of higher communism is that people are freed from the struggle and necessities. Advanced machinery does the socially necessary work, and then people are free to develop their creative talents and to care for family members and do things that are not bound by necessity. I think that's going to be absolutely central to China's future 20, 30, 40 years from now. And I think one reason why artificial intelligence is so important in China is because artificial intelligence promises to do the socially necessary work. It promises to do the work that advanced machines were supposed to do in Karl Marx's vision of higher communism. And we might well view China 20, 30 years from now as a society where AI does much of the socially necessary work, and then human beings are free to develop their creative talents and to care for needy family members as a kind of Confucian ideal. So in a way, it's a very exciting time to think about China. Again, these are the ideals, right? There's a huge gap between ideals and reality, but we have to be clear about what the ideals are to think of how to reduce the gap between ideals and the reality. And arguably, they're quite distinctive to China. What about international relations? Well, international relations, I think there's an official view that it's win-win, right? That when China deals with other countries, ideally, it should promote arrangements that are beneficial to both China and to those other countries. That's win-win. Now, I think that's central to China's ideal in terms of international relations. And I think it was true in China's past, like arguably the tributary system, at least one when it worked well, involved the smaller countries paying tribute to China, but China would reciprocate by economic and security benefits. So it was a win-win kind of arrangement when it worked well. What was wrong with the tributary system is that there was an assumption that because China is more powerful, then it's morally superior. We don't accept that anymore, right? Just because China's bigger, it doesn't mean it's morally superior. So for win-win kind of arrangements in the future, China, arguably, in terms of ideals, should adopt a position of humility when it deals with other countries and should be willing to learn from those other countries. I think that's really central to China's political vision. Now, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, again, of course, it's mainly with surrounding countries, and much of it is economic. It's win-win in this narrow sense, that it's mutually beneficial in an instrumental sense. But there's also recognition that if it's just instrumentally beneficial to both countries, it's not very stable, because once the relations change, like once China as a powerful country decides that it's no longer in its interest to help those smaller countries, then those relations might break down. So there's a need for more stronger form of reciprocity based on shared values and interests. And that's really the challenge for the future, is to develop win-win relations that are not just instrumentally valuable, where you have mutually economically beneficial ties, but also mutual interests, common values. It sounds a bit utopian, but I mean, think of it in the West. I'm from Canada, and I don't really, I'm quite skeptical of US foreign policy, but I must admit that, well, sometimes having common values in the US is good for Canada, because the US can provide a security umbrella to Canada. Canada could spend more on its welfare system. And even if there's temporary hiccups, like under the Donald Trump administration, there's deeper values underpinning ties between Canada and the US. I think that's China's future as well. Think of how to have common ties, especially with its neighboring countries, where there's already common kind of Confucian culture. How can China develop these win-win relations that are beneficial, not just in an economic sense, which is important, but also in a kind of deeper sense of common values and common vision of the good? I think that's really the challenge. And I think it's easier to build with neighboring countries where there's already this kind of common Confucian culture. Of course, China has to do better at home. It has to set a much better model at home, right? It has to be more humane at home and less repressive. Only then will other countries be willing to engage with China. But if China can provide economic and security benefits to neighboring countries, be more humane at home, then I think there's very much prospects for this deeper form of reciprocity 20, 30 years from now. The big problem, and here I agree with what was said before, the US has to make room for China. The US cannot be the dominant hegemonic power forever, especially in the East Asian region. That's ridiculous. The US has to make room for China, and it'll take time, but I think that's really the key for China to allow its ideals to develop. The US has to make room for China. I think that's absolutely central. So I think more or less I've spoken for 15 minutes. Let me just say a little bit about China's ties with countries outside of East Asia. I mean, I think, of course, there has to be win-win relations where it's economically beneficial as well. But at the end of the day, it also has to strive for deeper kind of cultural and values common visions. That's a huge challenge, but it's one that is necessary for the future. But China, unlike the US or maybe France or other countries with a kind of more, let's say, missionary kind of zeal, China will, I mean, I think this sounds a bit extreme or even silly for me to speak on behalf of China, but I can say this with a bit of confidence. China does not want to export its values by force. the idea of China invading other countries to promote its political vision, like the US invading Iraq, is just so completely foreign to Chinese political culture. You know, China has not gone to war with 1979. China is well aware that peace is very important to develop at home and to develop better ties with other countries. So I think in this sense, we have to be confident, unless China is severely provoked into war by other countries, I think we can assume that there will be peaceful relations in the foreseeable future. So thank you very much for letting me in here.
Well, also a very interesting presentation. You talk about the framework that guides the Chinese conduct at home and abroad, and see a connection and explains the connection between them. Shang Huang, your turn.
Thank you, Ambassador Marcos, and thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Professor Liu. Actually, I will divide my presentation into three parts. The first part, I will talk about 3 short and medium term grand strategy for China. I mean, a near and the medium term. The second, I will talk about how the approaches for China to achieving these goals, or short and medium term goals. The third, I will talk about the potential traps ahead for China's achieving these 3 short and medium term goals. So first of all, I think a lot of people noticed that China's wolf warrior diplomacy. I think Ambassador Marcos, you are diplomat, career diplomat, you know this better than I. So I think this really creates a lot of controversy, at least I think controversy among the diplomatic circles. And also we know the recent counter sanctions imposed by China on, we know the US partners or allies, right? So people talking about these, you know, countermeasures, counter sanctions. So people say, well, China now can already look at the world on an even level. So that means China is on par with you know, the US and the Western world. So the you Western guys cannot be lecture us anymore, right? So this is kind of the we call the rising nationalism, or we call increasing confidence in China's capabilities to deal with the foreign, you can see foreign coercion or foreign aggression. But having said that, I would argue that China is still striving for a non-hostile international and particularly regional environment. So I totally agree Professor Liu's argument that China really wants to be kind of development partners. China still, you know, if you look at the recent Chinese diplomatic overtures, like State Councilor and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's Middle Eastern trip and his meeting with his Southeast Asian counterparts in Fujian, China, and also latest the online discussion between China's president and Chancellor Merkel and the President Macron. So you can really tell China really want to, you know, seeking a kind of out of the encirclement design and imposed by America. So I definitely, you talk about a lot of jargon like diplomatic, waxing diplomacy, and China's PPE diplomacy in the early stage of the pandemic. So I think this really, you know, is in China's view, this goodwill approaches can really win over minds and hearts of the rest of the world. So facing the pressure, the mounting pressure from the US coordinated Western camp, or we can say Western alliances, China is really want to, number one, I think drive a wedge, you know, among the Western partners. Definitely, you know, the climate change and the biodiversity is definitely is two of the key pillars for Chinese win over friends, you know, approaches. And the second, I was talking about Ambassador, you're talking about what's the real meaning of dual circulations. So my view is that as China, the dual circulation means as China reduces its dependence on foreign technologies markets, it can still function as major markets and manufacturing base for foreign firms and the consumers. In doing so, China maintains an important leverage in its increasing tense relations dealings with West. Suppose such a scenario if China allows Google or Facebook or social media giants here in China today, so when former President Trump imposed a trade war or tech war against China, China can really lobby those Silicon Valley giants to to stand aside with China. I think this case, which has been evidenced by the companies like Qualcomm, like Apple, because these two American companies really reap huge benefits from Chinese markets, right? So I think if you can really get foreign companies and consumers, particular business community on your board, you can really hold a strong leverage against potentially more dangerous foreign sovereign governments. So by drive a wedge between the sovereign governments and the business community and the consumers. Third, I would argue that China short and medium term strategy is to double down on its influence campaign and the Trump offensive beyond its borders to preempt future encirclement on the part of West. So everybody knows that the U.S.-China relations is destined for the kind of, I would say, maybe people like to use the word new Cold War, but I would argue that even we don't use the word or phrases to describe the current state of affairs between these two countries. I think we are seeing clearly a kind of parallel universes between Washington and Beijing in terms of the technology standards, in terms of the social governance approaches. So you can see part of decoupling definitely has been taking place. So I think in order to push back against American newly formed aggressiveness and assertiveness, China really wants to take all kinds of measures, preempt future encirclements initiated by Washington. So this is three short and medium term grand strategies. But the second question is how to achieve these goals. I think we definitely need to turn to a conventional wisdom. That means a combination of a carrot and a stick approaches. So first of all, China really wants to continue to emphasize its commitment to multilateralism and United Nations-centered international institutions. So you can see and listen to a lot of speeches by President Xi and other senior Chinese figures that we put premium on the importance of UN, United Nations-centered international system. Yes, China is the best, the biggest beneficiary of the post-World War II international institutions order. Even this order was formed and defended by America, but nobody can doubt the fact China is the really biggest beneficiary of the post-World War II system. So from that perspective, I don't think China really want to upend the current system. China really want to have a kind of fine-tune the system and to make China be sitting beside the table to dictating some rule of games instead of just listening to abide by the rules and the norms set by the US. And another thing really pushed China to have this kind of revisionist ideas that you can see the US definitely is in the relative declining in terms of its economic and even soft power, right? So China definitely acute sense the the vacuum. You can see the power vacuum or hard power and soft power vacuums. So China definitely want to fill the void vacated by particularly for the past 4 years by the Trump administration. So definitely a combination of carrots and the stick approaches. And another thing is that I think China is determined to defend its core interest. Here we can see actually a growing list of taboo topics. Previously we talked about 3 T's, right? Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen, but now you can see Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea. So a growing list of China's core interest. So China actually by pushing against the US, these imposing China's own sanctions, I would call it some disproportionate sanctions on Western allies or partners. China really don't show any mercy or show any illusion that we will back it down, face even the united front of the Western world. So there's no any leeway or you can see the leg room for compromise once it comes to this growing list of transnational interest. So I think this is very manifested in China's latest spate of countermeasures, counter sanctions against the American allies and partners. And in doing so, China actually sacrificed its short-term economic interest. So I think the case point is listed the CAI, China-EU bilateral investment treaty. So by imposing sanctions, EU parliamentarians, China actually had, I would not say the deal has been, actually bungled or it has been, abandoned, but the chances are that, the deal cannot be resumed anytime soon. And so China, by doing so, China actually is willing to sacrifice its short-term economic and financial interests. And also, I was talking about alignment with international best practices and the dust of the importance of compliance. Still, the guiding lines for Chinese diplomatic and the foreign policies. So number one, I think previously, both Daniel and Professor Liu talking about the BRI, Belt Road Initiative, and the Confucius Institute. So I will expound on this. So I think China definitely has adjusted its flagship BRI, Belt Road Initiatives, and make it financially more viable, environmentally more sustainable, and operationally more compatible. So you can see, if you look at the second summit of BRI, China actually has acutely realized the controversies surrounding its labor and the environmental standards and the potential damage to local communities. And also definitely, this Leng Ai about the debt trap controversy, So China realized that the previous policy bank and the politically charged Belt and Road is not working any longer. So China, because of pandemic, China really are lacking in sufficient funds to support this, we call the giant projects. Sometimes you can call white elephant projects. So China cannot afford it. Let me be honest with you. So I think in order to make it the new, I would call the BRI 2.0 version, more sustainable, more workable, China really need to think twice before it go all in on pushing ahead this project. So you can see incremental and gradual adjustment in China's even the flagship overseas projects. And the second thing about, for example, the soft power projection evidenced by Confucius Institute. So you can see actually China Confucius Institute hit a lot of headwinds over previous years, particularly a lot of American and Australian higher educational institutions have canceled their cooperation with the Confucius Institute. So people really see China is become very aggressive and to use the Confucius Institute as a springboard to propagate the communist ideals, ideologies. So I think particularly for the neighboring countries, like particularly Southeast Asian countries, they realized back in the 1950s, 1960s, China acts a big export of communist ideas. So everybody knows that why the ASEAN, Southeast Asian, Southeast Asian ASEAN was formed just for the purpose of pushing back against the communist aggression, right? Back in the 1960s. So people actually have a vivid memory of China's exporting the communism and other ideologies, particularly along his near shore, it's the neighboring countries. So I think China realized the backlash from the foreign company or from foreign governments. So we need to think twice before we moving ahead with the previous Confucius Institute, we call it the culture aggressiveness evidenced by the Confucius Institutes. Third, I was talking about the potential traps in achieving these goals. Number one, I think Professor Liu mentioned that recent China-Iran 25-year deal. Personally, I wrote op-ed about the pros and the cons of this 25 long-term deal with Iran. We know actually the Middle East, particularly Iran, is kind of I'm not a quagmire, but kind of the uncertain geographic area. So you really need to avoid an all-in approach like this. If you really want to, I can really understand Chinese foreign policy, ideas behind these aggressive approaches. But in order to defend or in order to push back against American aggression, the last thing you need to do is to hurry to push back against this aggression. So maybe I think in a nutshell, the cure may be worse than the disease. So this is my first observation. Potential traps ahead for China. The second is that we know actually China tried to soften its image in the world by doing a lot of the goodwill approaches like vaccine diplomacy, export PPE to pandemic hit countries But the softness in diplomacy actually is in danger of being overshadowed or drawn by shrill rhetoric and disproportionate countermeasures. And the commensurability could be viewed as a weakness at home. So people really has a kind of vivid memory of Anchorage, diplomatic spats between Chinese senior diplomats and their American counterparts. So actually, I think I can see those senior diplomats try to play to their domestic audience. Actually, they are not targeting each other. So actually, they try to play to the domestic audience. So by doing so, actually, you are not really conducting diplomacy. Actually, you are trying to play to domestic nationalism, domestic rising, sentiments against the American, encirclement, we call it American imperialism. So things like this. So I don't think it's really wise or smart to manifest this kind of hostility on the world stage, because really could cause kind of backlash and cannot win over what we call the noise and hearts of the Western the ordinary people. And you look at the Pew data, you can see more than I think 73 or 75% of Americans hold unfavorable views of today's China, and I think the same proportion you can see in the other Western capitals, even some emerging economies. So if you really look at the real data on the ground, you need to think twice, before you really launch this disproportionate countermeasure. The final point I would argue that is really about Chinese domestic dynamics. We talk about internal issue like a sluggish transformation of economic growth model and deficiency of cutting-edge technologies. I think those two shortcomings and drawbacks really stand in the way of China's rise. If China really want to be we call the modernized socialist country by 2035 or by the middle of the century, they really need to kind of break through in technological development and what we call the foundational science and the technology. That's why when President Xi inspected Tsinghua University yesterday, and he really say the message is quite clear, no doubt about this, that we need the likes of Tsinghua University to kind of breeding ground for top-rated technicians, engineers, and the scientists. So only by doing so, developing homegrown technologies can China be, on par with American and the Western world. But it's so the tricky issue is that both sides, I mean Washington and Beijing, think time and the momentum are on our side. So Beijing think let's wait out American democratic administrations, and by 2031 and by 2050, we will definitely be the #1 in the world in terms of economic output, in terms of military capabilities. But Americans say now, because the past 4 years, unusually Trump administration, now Americans back. We are getting to normal. We will compete with the U.S. We will compete with China on all fronts. So because if the U.S. can retake its root, can retake its spirit, the U.S. can be invincible. So as Secretary Blinken said, it's never wise to bet against America, things like this. So interesting is that both sides think momentum and the time are on their side, but I don't know, and I will leave the time to tell the truth. So I will stop here.
Well, very rich presentation, many objective points and examples of how China proceeds. Let me start the second part of our session today, which is my interaction with you. And I'll follow the order of speakers because it's easier. You have been, I really appreciated your presentation because you show China as a victim of wars, and so China being able to understand the reality in a different international reality in a different way. And you highlight the idea of globalization and the idea of an inclusive vision of China. And also you talk about spaces and that China has to occupy. But I think behind your comments, as much as behind Shanghuang's comments, I think that's the idea that there's the idea that the decline of the West is one of the elements of the Chinese strategy. And when you even talk about Europe, saying that, well, Europe may have political positions, but they depend economically on us and they have a connection with us. And then you talk about the US having elections, changing its own reality, so it's not a stable scenario and all that. Am I right to say this, that the decline of the West is one of the central elements behind Chinese thinking about the world?
Yes, I think that's partially right. The decline of the West is becoming more and more a reality of today. I would say it's a relative decline because that is also a natural process. If you consider the population of the developed world and also the development potential was unlocked in the rest of the world, not only China, but also India, the BRICS countries, and also other emerging economies. So it's not a bipolar world now. It's more and more a multipolar world, and also culturally and economically diversified world. That's why all countries, including China, have to adapted themselves to this new reality, to think about the new rules, new institutions, arrangements, and values to adapt to the reality. Because if you think some institutions, powers, or values are superior than others, then you cannot adapt to this new reality. So that's why a lot of countries join China to co-initiate the new development bank and the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank and Belt and Road initiatives, because the rest of the world are offering more chances for cooperation and economic development besides the Western powers. The West is still important in terms of their policy initiative capacity and economic resources. So I think today's world, I think China's approach to the international relations, like the mutual respect, this dialogue, win-win, this is kind of new values for today's world. So sometimes it's difficult for the Western countries to follow, because they think, like Professor Bell mentioned, a missionary approach. Try to make the world the same value, not the shared value. It's the same value. That's difficult to. That's not workable for a diversified and world, considering the development levels, population, political institutions, religions. So we have to design a new vision for this diversified world. Of course, the rest of the world have more capacity to do more, to contribute more to the new order. Thank you.
Daniel, I think that China has a perception that the West wants to demonize its policies and its political and economic regime. But at the same time, I think there is a general expectation that China would look at the values in the West in a different way and get adapted to these values, because otherwise we cannot have a world that is, that is kind of more uniform or less controversial. How do you see the end of it? China, keeping its own values and believing that the West wants to demonize China, and the West keeping its own values and criticizing China all the time. Is there a balance point?
Thank you. It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, as mentioned, I think there are some common values, like agreement on, we can use a language of basic human rights. Don't murder innocent people, torture is bad, slavery is bad, genocide is bad, and people have a right to basic material welfare. I mean, I think that's at the level of principle, there's a kind of consensus. It's more in the West, though, that there's a view that there's only one morally legitimate way of selecting political leaders, and that's by means of democratic elections. And countries that don't use that system, the leaders are somehow fundamentally illegitimate, and so is the whole political system. I mean, that view is just so dogmatic, so China is lumped together with, family-run dictatorships like North Korea, brutal military dictatorships like Myanmar, and so on. Well, but China is a very different political culture. So it's very important to allow for morally legitimate pluralism when it comes to thinking of what's the best way of selecting political leaders, that it depends on a country's political culture, on its national conditions, on its history, and so on. I think most Chinese intellectuals and political leaders recognize that, that elections might work fine for countries like the United States. Well, whether they work fine, we can argue about that but at least there's not, it's better than the alternatives. Whereas in China, maybe we should allow for a different way, morally different ways of selecting leaders that are more meritocratic. And I think it's just, I mean, I'm from Canada, and I was brought up with this view as a child, that if you don't use elections to select leaders, the system is fundamentally bad. It's such a dogmatic view. I think there, frankly speaking, the problem lies more with the West than with China. I mean, I think China, there's view for more political pluralism in that respect. So I think that the demonization of China, it comes from the view, there's a recognition now in the West that China is not going to become like us politically and economically. It's going to be different. And because of that, I don't know, there's this tendency to attribute the worst possible motivation to what the leaders say and to the government's policies. I think there's a need for a bit more openness when it comes to thinking of what's the best way of selecting political leaders, and also what's the best way of organizing the economy. I mean, I think China's government will take a stake in key technologies that are seen as affecting China's political future. I mean, it's, in that sense, maybe it is different than the United States. You know, there won't be a kind of Google that's more powerful than the government. I mean, that's part of the socialist economic system, while still having lots of room for private enterprise. So I think the West has to allow for morally legitimate variation. That said, I mean, I totally agree with, you know, with Mr. Huang, that the kind of shrill rhetoric is totally counterproductive. And, you know, diplomacy, I mean, wolf warrior diplomacy, I mean, that's a kind of oxymoron. You know, if you're very shrill, it's not diplomatic. You're not going to persuade anybody, at least, for example, in the West, and that there's a need for a much more, let's say, humble and thoughtful way for China's vision to be communicated abroad. I mean, definitely this shrill rhetoric and wolf warrior diplomacy is totally counterproductive. I mean, maybe it has beneficial consequences in terms of gaining support at home, but it's definitely counterproductive in terms of persuading people abroad.
Well, Shan Huang disappeared from our screen. Are you there, Huang? I think he's no longer here. I have a question for him, but while he's away, are you there? While he's away, I'll give the floor to Anna Jaguaribe. She wants to make a comment or pose a question. I don't know. Anna.
Well, thank you very much, Marcos. First of all, I want to congratulate you on organizing such an exciting debate. And I have a question to all three participants in essence. Professor Liu Haibin started his comments by saying that, in fact, China's behavior towards the world was going to be radically different. And then all three participants focused on this intermediary, let's call it intermediary period, in which historical circumstances are no longer favorable to China's rise, and China has to mediate the difficulties in front of it. In my view, it's going to be another important thing that Liu Haibin said, was that in the beginning, as if there was a beginning of the international order, there was a certain consensus among participants. It is true that there was a consensus among participants, but there were very few participants. So to a certain extent, the diversity has always been a problem of the system. My question to them is, if you look beyond this intermediary period, how long are they contemplating this intermediary period in which intermediary actions can be taken? What is the long-term view of how this situation can evolve? That would be one question. The second question is more towards Professor Bell. Professor Bell, I think we are all in agreement with you with regards to the great advantage of meritocratic leadership. But one issue here is China has risen. It has gone beyond its catching up phase. It already is an established power, but an established power in a non-status quo world and in a world with deep change. How do you view this meritocratic system facing to deep questionings with regards to employment, the use of artificial intelligence, and things which are happening today in China? China is producing enormous amount of qualified personnel, and in which there is difficulty in finding employment for all of these people. The debate of artificial intelligence is not so much just a debate on how you achieve leadership in this area, but how you use it. So my question to him is, what is the internal debate in China regarding the big changes that society will have to have in order to face the future with artificial intelligence? These are two big questions, so I would limit myself to them. But I want to say that this debate was really extraordinary.
Jaime, you can start. Let's follow the order in which we started.
Thank you, Ambassador Anna. Your comments are really insightful. And yes, sometimes we are talking about the future scenario. And in China, there is a traditional wisdom that's so-called, if you don't look at things from a long term, then you will meet the short-term difficulties. So if we with this long-term, the big picture in our minds, we will avoid many mistakes in the short period. So it's a challenge theoretically for the international scholars to manage or to achieve a peaceful transition of power. That's the most challenging one, because different from the sovereign states, today's world is living in some kind of anarchy, globalized world, but still anarchy. There's no world government to take care of this kind of power, the competition among the rising or establishing powers. So they have to take care of themselves. That makes the world more difficult to manage, especially we have quite unstable existing arrangements. We see a lot of different divergence and convergence for the Western allies system. We see a lot of aspirations for the Western powers to achieve strategic autonomy, like the UK exit from the European Union, which was what the European Union was treated as a quite successful model to solve the power rivalries among the European countries, powers. So there is no successful models to follow. That's another challenge. So countries, when countries are talking about the confrontation or conflict, they should remember these countries are nuclear powers. Don't forget that. You think you can control the level of the conflict, but that's a misunderstanding, misperception about you cannot control the escalation of the conflicts. If you cannot totally or successfully solve the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, how can you expect you will win another war with a world power? So let's be realistic about the reality, even it is still in an intermediary period. So let's be pragmatic and realistic, and to focus on the cooperation, the diplomatic ways to manage this kind of power transition, and to focus on the global issues to find solutions. I think that's what we should do, rather than to try to prevent the rise of others. That's an unaccomplishable task. Thank you very much.
Daniel, it's your turn, and then I'm going to ask a final question to Shan Huang, and we close the debate because it's almost time.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Anna. Excellent question about AI and unemployment. What are the debates in China? I mean, there's many debates, but generally speaking, I think there's a bit more optimism about AI than there would be in the West. And here's a very important reason. that there's a view that China is in a dangerous situation because it will get old before it gets very rich, whereas most countries, they first become rich and then they become older. So China might be in a situation where you have because of the one-child policy in the past, now it's two-child, of course, you have too many old people, not enough productive people. Well, who's going to take the place of productive people? I mean, it's already happening in southern China in many factories. I visited Shenzhen last week. Many factories around there find it hard to hire people now because they don't want to work for those low wages. Who's going to help then? AI. I mean, that's the hope, that AI will replace a lot of the menial and necessary work. This will allow for China to move to a transition where it could be both older and richer. So I think that's one important reason for optimism. Another important reason is because of this value of filial piety, care for elderly parents, still so central to Chinese culture. But again, because of this one child per family policy in the past, now you have many adult children who have lots of elderly parents to care for, and they just don't have time and resources to do that. So who's going to help? Well, could be care robots, who could do a lot of the menial tasks that adult children would normally do, helping to care for their elderly parents. I mean, it's already happening now, and of course, it'll happen much more in the next 10 or 20 years. So I think that there's a bit more optimism about AI because it could help to it's viewed as a way of helping to resolve China's problems. In the long term, as mentioned in my talk, I mean, there's a view that AI could replace almost all the socially necessary work, and then people could be free to develop their creative talents. And as Marx have viewed in this ideal of higher communism, that's still not a very public debate, but it's one that certain intellectuals are still engaging in at the moment. So again, more optimism about AI than would be the case typically in Western countries.
Thank you very much. Xiaohuang, you touched a number of different and interesting points, but I can't resist asking you an economic question. There is a general sentiment in the world that the state economy is increasing its force in China. The private sector is vibrant, but the state economy is very strong now, and there are policies to encourage the state economy. And associated with that, there is this idea of dual circulation that you mentioned in your presentation, which emphasizes the role of the national economy, isn't it? Some people say that the dual circulation is a way of making the whole world depend on the Chinese internal market, isn't it? Because the internal market has an importance over the external market. And at the same time, you see China reducing its ODI, isn't it? The level of outbound investments is decreasing, and it's still very low. It's high in Latin America, but when you look at the world, the investments of China abroad as a percentage of GDP is much lower than the investments of other more mature economies. So, kind of a inward focus. At the same time, we see China moving towards the internationalization of the RMB. And just yesterday, as we were discussing before our debate, one of the vice chairmen of the central bank was saying that, well, China wants to have a currency that is at the disposal of the world, perhaps not to replace the US dollar, but at the disposal. So there are contradicting, views about, there are many misunderstandings about what's going on in the economic scenario. You see, how do you see China in the long run? You see China more or less integrated into the world reality?
Well, thank you for your question. I think the biggest lesson China learned from the past 2.5 years trade war and tech war and increasing hostility between the US and China is that we cannot rely upon the previously assumed friendly international environment. That means we must be more self-sufficient, self-dependent. So that's why we put a great premium on the importance of domestic markets, not about consumer markets, but also the manufacturing capability. So that means China really definitely to rely upon itself. So it's really look back on the the Mao's era. So at that time, but because of the increasing international encirclement and the restriction of on the exports and consumer goods, so this really make people think about the planned economy era. I will not say today's China can really go back to the planned economy, half a century ago, but definitely it need to learn hard lesson that if you continue to rely upon volatile international environment, particularly the friendly economic environment, that's not realistic, So I think this is a lesson number one. So lesson number two is that if you look back China's outbound investment, in previous years, particularly in the developing economies like Latin America, like African countries. So actually, I would say it's really a mixed. Talking about achievement, it's really mixed. So it's definitely China expand its influence, also expand its economic interest that and drawing a lot of the friendship and the goodwill of the local community from the sovereign governments. But at the same time, the flip side of the coin is that actually trying to draw the same level controversy, even backlash. So I think it's really a mixed feeling about the outbound investment. So China, and also because of pandemic and because of China's realized that the pandemic really hit China's economy a lot, and we cannot spread the money like previously. So China really need to be cautious in do a lot of overseas investment. So just look no further than China's policies. So everybody knows that XXII Bank and the Chinese CDB, China Development Bank, they are biggest loan issuers for the Chinese overseas projects. But if you look at the particular past 2 and 1 years, if you look at the approaches and the policies within this policy bank, so they're really hesitant to give uncontrolled, unscrupulous, loans to the developing markets. So they really double down their internal audit and their internal at-risk control about their loans issuance. So I think this is lesson number 2, that we cannot spend thrift like as previously we did. And the third things about I think. When the international environment is becoming more hostile or less friendly to Chinese investment, and so we really need to forge kind of the independent or semi-independent, you can say, monetary or the system. So you're talking about the internationalization of renminbi. So I think definitely you heard about the digital currency. So China will be the first sovereign government to launch or issue the digital renminbi. So I think the message is clear cut that China really want to reduce the attack from a US dollar dominated international currency system. So we try to circumvent in restrictions and the coercions wielded by the US dollar hegemony, right? So if you look at the sanctioned peoples and entities in China, even at Hong Kong, the chief executive Hong Kong SAR, when she was on a sanctions list, she cannot, go through normal banking operations. So people realize that the Achilles heel now for Chinese international ambitions, the Achilles heel is the US dollar dominated currency system. So you need to try your best to come up with a new idea or alternative way to reduce or cushion the impact launched by the US dollar dominated system. So I think the message is quite clear. Chinese government and Chinese authorities holds no illusion that the hostility on the part of the Western, particularly US, will be ended anytime soon, or even with the rotation within the White House. No way. I think the a more assertive, a more hostile the US is inevitable. So the question is, what else can we do? Because as Professor Daniel mentioned, that China, in demographic terms, China become older before it's become rich. So I would argue that in international political science terms, China really before it become powerful enough to take on the US, it's already exposes its weaknesses and already encircled by the US allies, or you can say united front. So what else you can do to break through this encirclement? I think this is the biggest question mark for Chinese not policy leaders, but also economic decision makers. So we really need to come up with a multi-pronged, multi-faceted approaches to deal with, the encirclement from economic, financial, military, political, diplomatic fronts. So it's really like all-out war. Maybe you can not war, but all-out competition. Let's use the word competition or confrontation in the years to come. So I think Chinese leaders hold no illusion about the upcoming head-on collisions between Washington and Beijing. So let's fasten your belt and get ready for kind of bumpy road ahead.
Well, we got to the end of our time. I think everybody agrees with Anna that we had an excellent debate. And I thank you wholeheartedly, our three speakers, because you were really very interesting in your presentations. And I think that the objective of this debate, which is understand the Chinese mind frame about international politics and about the international reality was reached. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. I think the audience, there may be some people frustrated because they didn't have the opportunity to ask questions, but we have a very faithful audience with us, still a number of people watching the debate, which I attribute to the quality of our speakers and to the interest in China and in the Chinese reality. Thank you very much. I hope we see you in the next CEBRI debate. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Have a good evening.